Endings don't interest me in novels at all. There's something to do with the writer's problem, not mine.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I like the description of what's the problem is, or who the people are, and the way they get on and talk, maybe. But
yeah.
The plot, oh God, no, give me a break. Definitely not.
Hello and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. I'm Julia Copus, a poet and a Royal Literary Fund Fellow. In this series, we invite a guest writer to join in conversation with voices from the RLF audio archive. We'll be listening in on other writers as they reflect on their experiences and creative processes. Our guest today is Hugo Williams, one of Britain's most distinctive poets, whose collection Billy's Reign won the prestigious T.S. Eliot Prize in 1999. Hugo is known for his irony and sharp wit and the, I think, inimitable style of his writing. He writes about family, love and memory in a voice that feels both spontaneous and intimate, like he's having a private chat with you. There's a plain-spoken, emotional clarity to his work. In tone, his poems might be funny one moment and deeply moving the next, or sometimes at the same time. Adjectives that have been used to describe Hugo's poems include suave, natural, intimate and laconic, on the one hand, but also, tellingly, I think, carefully controlled. A balancing act for which he was awarded the Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry. Hugo, it's an honour and a treat to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for being with us.
It's nice to be here. I like the balancing act. It reminds me of my wife, who was a tightrope walker.
Oh, of course, yes. Yes, she was. So you've picked that up from her. Well, I thought we could just dive straight in, and I want to start by thinking about your motivations for writing. But to get us warmed up, let's listen first to travel writer and memoirist Horatio Clare on what drives his writing.
One of my first jobs when I joined the BBC as a researcher was a series of radio programmes about Claude Monet. We had great fun making them. Monet often stayed in the Savoy Hotel. In those days, the rooms overlooking the river had glass-fronted balconies. Monet would rise early, start painting the effects of the sunrise and the smog on the water, and when the light changed, he'd put the canvas aside and start another, until he had a whole series of half-painted pictures. When he next saw the same colours on the river, he would return to the picture which most nearly matched them and work on it again. I learned a lot about him, but the thing which struck me was his explanation to the baffled Paris art world of what it was he was trying to do. "I am trying to give the viewer an impression of the feelings I have when I am looking at nature," he said. "It struck a chord right through me, to give someone else the same experience, the same thoughts and feelings you had when you saw beauty. I'm writing this on a dazzling, perfect morning in Yorkshire. The whole valley is full of birdsong. The sky is a mosaic of azure blues and white clouds. The sun is bright on the grass, and the woods across the stream seem to rejoice down to the merest twig in the fact of their being. Recording these things as I look at them and telling you about them as exactly as I can gives me a deep pleasure." I think that is why I started writing. I grew up in an extraordinarily beautiful place, on a mountainside in South Wales, which had views across the valley to the Brecon Beacons. My first book was a simple attempt to describe the life we lived there, the beauty that we experienced, and the battles my mother fought to keep and raise us there. Running for the Hills found a large and enthusiastic audience. I still get letters from around the world from people who shared the feelings we had through my words. It still seems something of a miracle. With a sense of a community of readers to talk to, which are purely imaginary when you start out, comes the chance to take them places and show them things. My 3 travel books, one about following migrating swallows from South Africa to South Wales, one about travelling the world on container ships, and one about the disappearance of a very rare bird, the slender-billed curlew, were responses to this opportunity. I thought that by going to unusual places and meeting people with very different lives, I would have stories to tell which readers would find engaging, moving, even important. Living and writing have thus become entwined. In this situation, you're not just a writer because you write, but because you live in such a way that you have stories to tell that demand to be written. My latest book, which is for children, featuring talking animals and a monstrous personification of the spirit of despair or depression, I wrote because I wanted to talk to children about depression and to make them laugh and entertain them at the same time. I'm writing another one now, also for children, about love and its trials and the necessity of loving insects. I'm writing to entertain, hopefully a lot, to inform, hopefully a little, and to inspire. Why? Because it is a privilege and a pleasure to try to do the best you can with whatever it is you do best.
Okay, so it's quite a long clip, and there's a lot to respond to there, lots that are really interesting. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, Horatio says that he was prompted to write by a simple desire to communicate the beauty of his childhood surroundings. And I'm wondering, does your own sort of writing itch stretch back as far as childhood?
It does, but not in that way, not in communicating beauty or communicating anything really, only to impress and amuse and entertain. Those were my priorities. And, I came from a theatrical family, so you were not supposed to open your mouth unless you got something amusing to say, entertaining, and otherwise keep your mouth shut. But I never had anything interesting to say. So I had to, when I got down to poetry, I had to make something up. So even if it seems to be spontaneously self-expression, it definitely isn't in my case. It always felt like, I don't know, discovery or searching for something or making it up, making up something.
And so you're making things up in order to entertain.
Absolutely.
So with
also
an audience
making up,
in mind.
also to find out something.
Yes.
Or to pretend.
Yeah.
That's another thing that you do with writing.
Yeah.
You find out something that then becomes yours because you've made it up.
Yeah.
So it's nothing to do with self-expression in my book. I mean, it may turn out to be to other people, look like self-expression, but in my case, it's definitely not.
And in terms of timing, when did you start writing?
Oh, God. Very early. Boarding school, aged 7.5. Not funny. And one of the things you do is to try and cheer yourself up a bit, not to cry,
Yeah.
I do remember being told what an iambic pentameter was. Whereas the English person, and he seemed to think that nobody could do it. And I put up my hand and gave him iambic pentameter without thinking, really. Seems so obvious. De-dum, de-dum, de-dum.
Age 7?
Well, no, maybe 12 or something. No, maybe
that's still impressive.
Maybe 9.
That's very impressive. Yeah.
And I made up something out of the Bible. David and Goliath, I think it was. The story of David and Goliath. And,
so you had an ear for...
Well, who doesn't? I think most people,
poets,
they're a little bit more grown up, can do it to be or not to be, if that is a question.
Yes, once they know what it is. Yeah.
And I couldn't understand why they didn't, but that got me a bit of a reputation.
For being a poet?
For English.
And also, for English, so you were good at English.
Yeah.
And I'm interested as well in so that's hard, isn't it, being left at that young age? It was rather, I suppose. Most of the boys were crying most of the time, but I didn't cry. So was your writing anything to do with coping with that sort of separation?
I think it was. I thought because I'd been sent away to boarding school, they didn't like me, and I really wanted to be interesting. But so they would like me and
to your family,
my family.
Yeah.
So I wrote these amusing things for them to see, because my older sister had written an anthology for my father for Christmas, and she'd copied in all the poems she knew into this in her very legible handwriting.
Yeah.
So I thought I'd make one for him for Christmas, and so I made this thing, and he was absolutely delighted with it. And this made me think that poetry was kind of popular form, and that everybody loved it. Wrong. Anyway, so I read this anthology during the term time.
Were they other people's poems?
Yeah, other people's poems, yeah.
Okay.
But that soon came to an end. I soon ran out of poems to copy into it.
Yeah.
So I started imitating these poems to fill up the book. So, for instance, Laurie Lee was my modern poet. Mm-hmm. And I copied a Laurie Lee poem or two. And then it seemed pretty easy, really. So
That's interesting to me as well, because there are poems in your collections that are written home from school, from boarding school.
they are
So
actually. They are. Strangely
actually
enough,
do
that is
that.
where I learned to write.
So you do it sort of literally in like dock leaves, your collection dock leaves, for instance.
Yes.
But you also have this sort of intimate, personal tone of letter writing or personal letter writing, and it goes through a lot of your work. It's a very direct tone, isn't it? Very sort of conversational, apparently casual tone. And I remember seeing poems from Lines Off, which is the collection that you wrote after your kidney problems.
Transplant, yeah.
And your kidney transplant, yeah. And about dialysis and so
That
on.
was before the transplant. Yeah, I had 3 years of dialysis and then 8 months in hospital after the kidney transplant. Yeah.
But I remember being struck by the very direct tone of them, which I think, from what you're saying, borrows something from this sort of letter writing style. But it can be a very interesting juxtaposition when you're talking about something so. I mean, it must have been a very traumatic time for you. I'm just wondering if that very straightforward delivery is a way of sort of distancing yourself emotionally from what you're writing about.
What is it? Sort of an attempt at making everything ironical by making it absurdly simple.
Yes.
So you sound as if you're talking, but actually you're doing something secretive, which is hidden. No, I never wanted to make it simple sounding, and I'm always looking for something more poetic and something more complex, perhaps. But it always turns out a bit prosy. That seems to be my style. I don't know what it is. There's something in me which longs to be terrifically direct, so in a kind of shocking way. So the shock is the effect of the poem in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big sort of
And
hallmark
with a
of your
joke as well.
And
So that's shocking.
Yeah.
Put a joke in.
the humour.
Yeah, the humour.
That's a big thing in your poems.
It is.
But I have also seen you in interviews describe your poetry as an indulgence or a hobby that's got a bit out of hand and so on. But it's clearly something that you want to keep doing. So what is it that keeps you wanting to write?
I do find it very satisfying. My whole being feels happy when I've done one. But it's practically not worth it. It's so much effort, It's so much work that I sometimes think, for God's sake, to do something better and easier, with some money in it. And I had no idea when I started. Everybody I knew seemed to be writing poetry. It seemed to be a natural thing to do, and everybody would like it, and you'd be famous and happy and loved, But it didn't work out like that because I didn't know anyone else who did it at all. I mean, it just so happened that my sweetheart's stepfather had a literary magazine, so I got a bit of encouragement from him.
Step up.
And when she got tired of me, he got me to work on the magazine. It was a wonderful London magazine. It was the magazine in town for that. At that
absolutely.
moment.
The London magazine.
Yeah, that was a fluke. That was one of these things that people look at me and think, God, he had it made, that guy, But it was a fluke.
Do you think you would have been a poet without that bit of serendipity?
You didn't plan that question. No, you're absolutely spot on to wonder about that, because I sometimes wonder.
Yeah.
I think I might have been a second-rate actor, or I might have been somebody who worked in the theatre, stage doorman or something like that. But I think I just might have been an actor because my whole family is actors.
Yeah.
My brother became one. He was not too bad. My father was a film star before the war and so on. And I sort of did slightly want that because it seemed to be so easy. You just walk around and people pay you money. So you learn the lines, you raise one eyebrow, and that's it.
I would like to ask you a bit about your process next. But first, we are going to hear from novelist Ian Ayres, and he's talking, in fact, about his reading habits.
Stephen King famously said a writer needs to write 4 hours a day and read 4 hours a day. If Stephen King could come round my house and do the washing and the ironing and the cooking and the cleaning, take the dog out, change the cat litter and make the beds, I might consider that possible. But he won't, so it isn't. Not for me, anyway. but the importance he places upon writing is spot on. Although I write for a living, I spend more time reading than I do writing. I read obsessively. Much of what drives this obsession is the deep need I have to fill the huge gaps in reading from my younger days. I left school at 15, having spent the last 2 years of school in the bottom set of English. Being in the bottom set, Shakespeare was deemed not appropriate, and George Orwell was just a name I'd heard my brother talk about. My brother being in the top set of English. I loved reading, especially poring over my nan and granddad's collection of Charles Dickens. But school, it seems, just wasn't for me. I've had a lot of catching up to do. I'm absolutely obsessive about which sort of books I read. I'll commonly have several on the go. I'll have a biography, usually literary or music, a classic, usually some huge Victorian novel, and something more modern, usually from my own publisher, which I will then also review. Every now and then I'll replace the modern novel with something classical, Homer, Virgil, Ovid, stuff like that. To tackle my Shakespeare deprivation, I read a Shakespeare play a week, an act a day, and intend to do so until the end of my days. The writer, Ray Bradbury, advises all writers to read a poem, a short story, and an essay every night for 1,000 nights, commonly known as the Bradbury Trio. In service to the Bradbury Trio, I have read poetry collections from Blake, Whitman, Milton, and Tennyson, short stories by Conan Doyle, Alice Munro, Kate Mansfield, and Virginia Woolf, essays from the London Review of Books, and an 1874 edition of historical and critical essays by Lord Macaulay. The effect reading these different forms of writing has had on my own writing has been immense. It feels like I am mainlining great writing, opening myself up to everything words can do. So, it appears my reading habits comprise daily readings of a music or literary biography, a classic novel and a modern novel. Every night, a poem, a short story and an essay, plus a Shakespeare play a week. Added to this are the audio books I listen to whenever I'm washing up, cooking and ironing. Blimey. I honestly didn't realise how far down the rabbit hole of reading I had fallen. If Stephen King does turn up one day and offers to take the dog for a walk or sort the washing out or something, I'm not sure I'll even hear him knock.
Ian Ayres there.
That's really good.
Yeah, he has a very disciplined approach to reading across the genres. What are your reactions hearing that, Hugo? Are you as disciplined as that in your own writing or your reading?
The opposite.
The opposite.
Never read books. Yeah. Almost never. I do have 1,000 books in my house, mostly inherited, or review copies or something. And I don't read much, but I do take them down and have a glance through them. They're all poetry.
Yeah.
And I do like glancing at a poem here and now and then. But to have read something carefully, studiously and regularly of an evening, absolutely not. I just read the same old poems very often. I must have read about 50 or 60 novels altogether, and it's usually the same novel. It's sort of the good old Lost Domain, the Grand Monde, the French one. It's the best book, and that's my only one I read. And with that, I only read the beginning anyway.
But you've read the whole thing at some point.
I've never read the whole thing.
You've never read the whole thing?
No, because I can tell straight away that the ending doesn't interest me. Endings don't interest me in novels at all. There's something to do with the writer's problem, not mine.
Yeah.
So I like the description of what's the problem is, or who the people are, and the way they get on and talk, maybe. But the plot, oh God, no, give me a break. Definitely not. And this one is worse than ever. It's a perfect description of a pre-war village in France. Yeah. Until he starts going off to some magical castle somewhere where everything turns into a sort of novel. Yeah. And after that, no thanks.
You're not interested.
So that's what I feel about most novels. Okay. I can get just as much out of Jane Austen by reading a few pages as reading the whole thing. It doesn't really interest me to read the whole thing. It's plodding, plod along. I like to read the paragraph and then the paragraph again to see the sort of way the clauses work.
That sounds like a very poety
way
of reading.
I'm interested in the English.
The sort of microscopic,
more than the satire.
Yeah. But I want to find out a little bit about your own process. And I did read something about how you cut strips of typewritten sentences
my method, yes.
Shuffle them around to get to the right sequence of sentences. Do you still do that?
Well, it's a way of making use of things you put in a notebook. You can type out all these little jewel-like expressions and phrases and descriptions and actions and narratives and things, and put them all on strips of paper. If you've got a big enough desk, you can put them all out on the desk.
Yeah.
And then you've got the problem of finding a beginning and an end, possibly an ending first. You find the ending and put that at the end, there on the right-hand side. And then you've got to say, wonder how the thing began. So a good opening line is really important. So those are the two things. Once you've got beginning and an end of the poem, this is only one way of writing. I don't do it quite so much now. I should do it again. But this was great fun to do because it made use of things I didn't know what to do with. I mean, there are, I think, 6 poems in that Lines Off book which are written like that, and they're mostly nonsense. But, people don't notice nonsense. They think it's poetry. So put it in and it's fine by them. They love it. That's what they want in poetry.
So and the ending. So you're not interested in endings when it comes to novels, but you start with the ending in a poem.
Yes, because it doesn't have to make sense in a poem.
Yeah.
You can have a sort of strange, a sort of enigmatic ending. The ending has to have an ending sound.
Yes.
Some sort of conclusion, which possibly is enigmatic,
But you recognise an ending when you see it, and that's when you choose that sentence.
I suppose it's tension-free. That's another thing that's quite nice. You don't have to think of an ending. You've got an ending because you sort of somehow wrote it without any purpose, and maybe it can be made of use. So it goes at the end, and then you've got to sort of fit it all together. So it's very much it's playing.
But the lines come from your notebook. Sorry, the lines come from your notebook.
Lots of stuff goes in the notebook, which is never going to be used. So I must have thought that possibly all this stuff could be, selected and sifted and done something with.
And you walk around with a notebook, do you? You do, and you write stuff down.
A little notebook,
Yeah. Do you write stuff in it all the time?
No.
Okay.
No, not much.
Just when it...
And very often when I look back at it, I can't make out what on earth I was thinking about.
Yeah.
And it means nothing to me.
I know, yeah.
And that's, in a way, quite interesting to come across again, something you don't know what it is.
And you've got to make something of it.
Yes, it's like a building block of some kind of decorative kind.
Okay, well, I want to move on to our next clip now, and it's on the subject of voice in writing. And voice is something that you pay very close attention to, I think, in your poetry. So here is Kerry Young on the subject of voice.
I wrote 7 versions of Pow, and only at version 4 did Pow get his voice. So the first 4 versions were written in standard English. The moment that it turned into Jamaican was that moment when I started writing in the notebook, sitting in Jamaica, having written 4 versions, so both Pow and I knew the story, that he then spoke. That was the first time it was written in patois, when he goes, me and the boys were sitting in the shop talking about how good business was, and that is when she show up. And it was Pow dictated that at version 5 or something, in a way that I sort of half remembered the sound of my father. And of course I was in Jamaica, so I was surrounded by that sound. That's when it came alive. That's when Pow became a real person with his voice. And I learned from that, because since then, I know that that's the way you start a book, with the voice. And it came to me strong. It didn't falter, because my mum said, you're not going to sustain that for the whole book. But I think I did.
Kerry Young there on the title character for her Costa shortlisted novel, Pow. It's very interesting, isn't it? And I think you hear that sort of thing so often from writers. They'll tell you how characters have dictated lines to them. It's like a private stage, sort of an intimate performance, and the characters are speaking directly to them. And I just wondered, given you mentioned your theatrical background and your father, the actor Hugo Williams.
Yes.
Yeah.
Kerry, she's got more of an opportunity there because Jamaican patois, whatever it is, whatever you call it, that's more difference in conventional English. So the language she was speaking had an identity of its own, whereas I couldn't tell the difference between my way of talking and my family's way of talking, really. We both spoke in the same way.
But do you ever have that experience of hearing a line, or as if someone else is speaking it? Do you relate to that at all?
No, I can't really relate to that. It seems that I spent so much time at school listening, that I already knew that I didn't have a voice unless I made it up.
Yeah.
So it was not something I copied ever. And I certainly never got any phrases direct. Well, maybe I did from directly, but this is not something I recognise.
So when you write down lines in your notebook, which we now know you carry around with you, where do they come from? Are they just?
Well, they might come from a friend, they might come from me, they might come from anywhere, but they're mine. I never feel that there's somebody else's voice.
Yes.
Almost never.
Okay, so they're not dictated
before. I never even thought of it. It's a completely new thought to me. I always assumed it's mine.
So those lines
even if
are
it was
more
somebody else's, I'd take it from my own. I'm sure I've stolen things like that.
So it's more from observation. They're observed or they're overheard.
Yeah, with something strange about it too. Something strange about the phrase. Maybe something contradictory or negative.
Yeah, and maybe something that you can't quite pin down, but it makes you feel
something mysterious.
Yeah. In terms of voice, when we think of it from a sort of linguistic point of view, you use a whole variety of voices in your...
Do I?
In your poems. Well, in terms of I, you, he,
she,
yes, they.
That's true, yes.
That meaning of voice. And you have said before that the I is a technical device rather than a me thing. So I wanted to ask you about that. It's a technical device rather than a me thing.
I suppose it is something you can pick up and drop as much as you want to. I think I use it a terrific lot as a way of being invisible and also somehow claiming the truth in some way or other. That if you say I, people sort of believe you because it's you speaking after all.
Yeah.
So that does have a validity. There is one poem in one book somewhere where I put he instead. And I've always wanted to change it because it just doesn't ring true. And
interesting, yeah.
I must have done that because it's about having somebody's name written across your heart. And it was about an X-ray. It's a joke poem about somebody having an X-ray. And the problem was that this girl's name was written across his heart.
It's a brilliant idea. Yeah.
But
where did that come from?
Not from your... to say it was me, I should have done.
That's not from your notebook,
But
then?
I sort of thought I was unconscious at the time, having this X-ray taken.
Yeah.
So I thought it better be he. And so I left it like that. But it actually could have easily been, I might have been awake when I had the X-ray taken. They might have shown me the X-ray and there was the girl's name written across my heart. Much more convincing.
Yeah.
Because
doing
it's got
the
truth
first
going
person.
for it.
Yeah.
She actually was, oh my dear, I've never seen this kind of X-ray before.
Well, there are many I's, I think, many Hugos inside you.
Really?
Well, don't you think? I mean, it feels like a whole acting troupe
It's
when you
an
read.
ego trip doing a thing like this,
Yeah.
I don't know. I've never thought of it.
Well, shall we cheer ourselves up a bit now and talk about rejection?
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea.
Before we do that, let's listen first to fellow Collected presenter and musician Paul Dodgson on the subject.
Just as I started making notes about rejection, an email arrived rejecting me for a project I really wanted to write. I can report that it hurt, but not as much as when, at the age of 18, the first poem I dared send out came back with indecent speed in the stamped addressed envelope I hoped never to see again. There is a myth about rejection. You send off your masterpiece and get turned down repeatedly until your fortune is changed at last by a single acceptance. You go on to sell millions of books and become an example of how one must never give up. That's the cliché. I'm here to talk about another sort of turn down, the ever-present repudiation that accompanies the life of many of us writers. For every bright spring of acceptance, there are gloomy winters of rejection. There are pitches for scripts that meet with approval but falter somewhere further down the line. The shows that go to pilot and then get the thumbs down. The ideas for articles that never receive a reply. The funding applications that get shortlisted but don't make the final selection. Then, for every play performed, script broadcast or book published, there comes another very public rejection. The bad review. A good one can give you a warm feeling for half an hour, but a bad review, that can mess things up for ages. One of my personal highlights was the time I discovered a devastating put-down of a theatre show in a national newspaper at 1 a.m. on Boxing Day. It's easy, when rejections accumulate, to feel as though the whole world is against me. But then I think of my own reactions to books, plays, and TV shows. I like some of them a lot, I'm indifferent to others, and dislike a few entirely. Not everyone is going to get everything, and that includes my writing too. Then I think about who is doing the rejecting. I once ran a writing workshop attended by a furious man who made sarcastic comments whenever I spoke. It turned out he was angry because the BBC had rejected his sitcom, and because I'd written and produced things for the BBC, he was angry with me. I think he believed that everyone in the corporation had rejected his work. Of course, it's not like that. Most likely, one person rejected it, quite possibly a reader who began the day with a pile of scripts as high as a house. It often isn't personal, even if it feels like it at the time. It's important for me to remember that rejection is only part of the story and only happens because I put myself forward in the first place. I think of it like background noise, always there and threatening to drown out everything else. But there have been acceptances too, and they have their own sweeter music. So try to listen to that music and not let it be overwhelmed by the other racket, however loud it threatens to be.
So that ends up being quite a level-headed take on rejection there from Paul. Now, Hugo, I have always thought of you as a writer who can send something out into the world and be almost guaranteed of acceptance. You know, so many of your poems have appeared over the years since I've been sort of growing up as a poet in the highest profile magazines, newspapers, journals. But I do know that that isn't the entire story because we've spoken about it. So could you tell us a little bit about your experience of rejection and how you respond to rejection and whether that's changed over the years?
It's the sort of thing you really have to have a conversation with somebody so you can hear their experience of rejection as well as your own, you know. But it's true that I had an incredibly good start with these people who knew a bit about London literary life and getting a job on the London magazine when I was 19 and so on. And that's all very positive.
So so you weren't experiencing any form of rejection at that stage when you started out?
Yes, I did get. I think I probably tried to get published by Faber when I was young.
You've blanked it out of your mind.
I think I did get bunched by that. So but I did get accepted by OUP, which did publish poetry in those days.
Who was the editor at Faber then when you?
Faber, Charles Monteith.
Oh, okay. Wow.
And then Craig Raine, and then
Christopher Reid.
Christopher Reid took me on.
Yeah.
After I'd been rejected several times by other people.
Yeah. So, and has your reaction changed when you get rejected? Is it less or more painful now? Does it happen more or less often? Tell us about that.
It's a bit of an embarrassing question, isn't it? Because one makes a fuss about it all, because it's not a big deal really getting a poem thing. So,
well, I think it can be very hurtful in the moment. It feels personal. You know, it's like Paul was saying. You know, it can feel very personal at the time, as if it's a response to your
So not the sort of thing that I actually write has come to an end. This sort of family stuff, which was really like Robert Lowell's life studies. If it wanted to be anything great,
Yes.
that's what it was aiming for. Finally, that was my dream.
Yes.
But that became absolutely unpublishable to do that sort of personal stuff.
To write in.
So I've had quite a lot of rejections by this personal stuff, with too much I, as you were suggesting.
So you feel that your poetry's gone out of fashion, your
Totally,
style of
that's what I
poetry's
was
gone.
trying to say.
Right,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's interesting.
Also, they don't answer now. You see, you don't know whether you've been rejected or not. They just put it to one side.
When you don't get an answer at all. Yeah. Well, but what you say about fashion is really interesting, because I'm remembering something that Catherine Maris said about Lines Off, your poetry collection Lines Off, the back cover of that. And I think it comes from a review that she'd written in the TLS. And I've got it here. She said, even as current trends in poetry favour the experimental and the overtly political, Williams's unchanging lyric persona remains, like James Bond, apparently immortal, one of Britain's most accomplished and distinctive poets. So she's suggesting that, James Bond, like you just...
I really couldn't... I love that. That's the kind of review I like.
You go on and on.
Yeah, compare me to James Bond, please, next time. That's great.
But you're saying that you don't quite agree, that you think you have gone out of fashion.
Well, my poetry is very simple-minded in many ways. There's no problem for it. If you happen to like it, if you ever liked it, you're not going to suddenly start to hate it, I don't think. On the other hand, new people coming up don't expect that sort of thing, and it's not what they look for in poetry anymore. It's much more to do with something more general, something wider, something more political and sociological, and so on and so on.
I mean, I think your style might be playful or frivolous, but the poems are actually doing quite sophisticated things. So your poems will often collapse time, for instance, so that the adult and the child self exist in the same moment. You do that a lot in your poems. Or in your sequence from the dialysis ward, where you write, I'm technically dead, they tell me, but I remember being alive as if it were yesterday. And then actually that poem's called Zombie, and just moving to the end of that poem, I remember the world above and what it was like up there, thanks to a friend who sucks my blood from me. He keeps me alive in the sense that memories are alive. That doesn't sound very throwaway to me. I think, your treatment of time is actually very sophisticated. Past and present coexist and so on. So what would you say in answer to that?
It may have something to do with my indifference to fiction, a dislike of plodding narratives and endings and plots and things like that. That I feel instinctively that I want to spare the reader that kind of thing. So each little poem is a little novel that's had the plot extracted from it, and all the dialogue thrown away, and all the tiresome narrative unravelling, and the page numbers, page 90, so and so on, stripped away, and the reader doesn't have to bother with that. They just get what might be written on the back cover to give you some idea of what the novel's about. That's the way to do it. I should call my next book Blurbs.
That's a good title. That brings us to our last theme today, which is the connection between location and the writer. And your work does have a very strong sense of place, I think. So we'll get to that in a moment. But first, here is travel writer Ginny Reddy talking about a specific location that's been important to her.
While researching Wonderland, a book about my unorthodox search for magic in landscapes across Britain, I read about Iona, an island in the Scottish Hebrides. Its pristine white sands set against a cobalt sea, there was something otherworldly about such beauty. What, I wondered, had drawn hermits, mystics, monks, and seekers to this place? I knew then that I would go. I hatched a plan of sorts. I would ask the land to guide me. Then I would listen deeply, deploy intuition and trust. In a spirit of playful experimentation, whatever direction the land nudged me in was the direction I would take. 3 weeks later, I found myself on a bench on Glasgow's Queen Street Square, having made the first leg of my journey from London. I sat in the autumn sunshine and contemplated a message I'd just received from an ex-psychiatrist who was an expert on landscape energies and who knew Iona well. The previous day, I'd emailed to tell him of my plan, and he'd replied making a tantalizingly cryptic suggestion. On the island, there is a diagonal valley rarely frequented called the Glen of the Temple. Walk down there and contemplate. I was thrilled. I took this as a sign that the land was reaching out to me. I would look for this temple. After the ferry from Oban to Mull, and another from Finnefort, I finally arrived in Iona's tiny harbour, just as the sun was setting. I was taken aback by the halo of soft golden light. The luminosity felt like a hug. And there was the quiet too, which was nothing like a city quiet with its eternal hum. Later, in the village, I asked a woman serving at the counter of the community shop if she knew where the Glen of the Temple was. "Never heard of it," she replied curtly. After 2 more brush-offs, a kindly woman at the Iona Heritage Centre unfolded a map of the island and pointed to a valley in the middle of it. "Here it is," she said in a soft burr. It had been decades since she'd been. She couldn't recall the exact route from the village and said that the bogginess and the lack of footpath would make it a difficult walk. With a sigh, I left and clambered down to the beach. The sea was a patchwork of teal and turquoise and midnight blue. I peered at it for a long time. I resolved to let the temple go. Wasn't there enough magic before my eyes? On my last day on Iona, I went for lunch in a cafe and spotted an artist named Deborah, who I had once met 3 years earlier on the Moray of Firth. She was here visiting and remembered me. I told her about my fruitless endeavour. "Well, why don't we try to find this temple together?" she said. I figured, why not?
Ginny Reddy there, hoping to find her voice in a remote glen in the Scottish Hebrides. So, Hugo, on this topic of location, I came across an old article about you in which you talked about your house in Islington, where you still live, and I think you've lived there since the 1960s. And you made a comment in that article that the house was not just a writing space, but a source of inspiration. And throughout all of your poems, there are quite a few real-life locations, you know, the hospital ward or the boarding school or all sorts of places, the house, streets around your home. So what is your relationship with location? It's quite a difficult
question. Something like nostalgia, I suppose. I did do some travelling when I was young. When I was 19, I went around the world. My father had some tax swindle he wanted to pull off, and if I left England for a year, I could inherit some film money he'd made from some film script or something or other. It didn't work really, because when I got to Australia, I was supposed to inherit this money that he didn't have to pay in tax.
Yeah.
Somehow or other the bank blew up, and not literally, but, you know.
Yeah.
And
it never happened.
It never happened. The money that he cost me to send me around the world, which took 18 months, by the way, he didn't make it. I mean, he just spent the money on sending me money to distant parts so I could carry on going around the world in buses. I didn't go from a single plane. But
in your work, I don't recall that many poems set abroad.
That's right. There's very few, really, but there are a few.
So do they interest...
Delphi, that kind of thing. Delphi.
Yeah, that's true. But do you think in general locations closer to home interest you more?
I am fascinated by areas,
Yeah.
like that, the souls of housemaids flowering in area gates, and that's the beginning of Prufrock.
Yeah.
That always. Now that I'm very slow on my feet,
Yeah.
I find myself getting very interested in leaning against the railings, peering into people's areas, because they're completely individual. Everyone's different, and all the staircases seem to go down in different directions into the area from the street. And you can lean on it, and it's not exactly illegal to look down into somebody's. I mean, it's not very nice. You don't want to be watched by the owner, but I do find it very, very interesting. I came past one today in Packington Street, and it was absolutely stuffed with dwarfs of one kind or another. This man had collected, I would say, several hundred dwarfs, and he packed them all in. There was no room for anything else at all in this area. And even the staircase was plucked, headed with there's the 7 dwarfs in multiples of hundreds.
Yeah.
He must be so sick of them by now, and he's obviously dead himself probably. And I don't know what he's going to do with all the dwarfs.
Well,
anyway,
isn't
I'm
it
sick of watching them
isn't it
myself.
your job as a poet to find out in a poem?
I'm definitely going to do one, I think.
Yeah. I think that would make a really good sequence, leaning on railings.
Yeah. This place is not a strong point in my life, I don't think.
Well, you say that, but I think there's something about this feeling of displacement. You talked about writing home from school.
Well, there is that. Oh,
Yeah.
yes, I could say something about it, in the sense that after the war, my father came back from being away for 6 years, and his career was more or less finished because he'd been famous before the war.
Yeah.
And after the war, they wanted Boy Next Door. That's all they wanted, Kenny
Right.
Moore and all that. And he wasn't.
He was too leading man.
He was too leading man and too pretty and so on. So he was bankrupted, and we had to live in very poverty-stricken circumstances and always moving on. So there are 7 or 8 interesting places to live in. We lived in stately homes that had a little attic flat or something where the maids had lived, and we'd stay there, and then we'd stay in a flat in Brighton, and then we'd get a rented room in Dorney somewhere, and then we'd move on. And as far as the children were concerned, me and my brother who was my sort of slave, it was great fun.
Is this your brother Simon?
Yeah.
The actor?
Simon Williams, the actor, yeah. It was such an excitement to be exploring the new world.
Yes,
It was
constantly.
completely new, and some of them were absolutely amazing. I mean, we went to Cobham Hall, which became a girls' school after we were there, and in the woods around Cobham Hall was something called Dickens' Chalet, where Dickens wrote some book.
Yeah.
And it was really hard to find in the woods because there was no path there.
Yeah.
It was a chalet.
Yeah.
And if you walked towards it, you might find it. But on the other hand, what also happened was that you suddenly saw Cobham Hall coming towards you because it's a circular path.
Right.
And this was always, we wanted to show this to the visitors. We said, we're going to show you Dickens' Chalet. And then we'd walk and walk and walk for an hour, and then there's Cobham Hall right in front of us. So that was a really amusing thing.
I'm wondering, though, if that sort of vagrant aspect of your life,
I think it did. I think it did. It must have, this change of situation.
Yeah.
Because not only did that happen, but boarding school was another kind of change of location as well. So I got so used to it. That's why I didn't react very strongly, because it's such an ordinary thing. I had no experience of continuity in background at all.
But it comes across really strongly in your poems. But it feels like a sort of an attempt very often to close the distance between one place and another, or the self and home, or past and present. And in the end, you sort of regret that distance can't be closed. I get that feeling really strongly from a poem of yours called Mirror History, which I love.
It's one of my better ones, isn't it?
It's very, very good. Yes, it's a superb poem. And I was just wondering if you would read the last stanza of that poem from Billy's Reign, because it encompasses a lot.
And all that. Is that the one?
It's not a handbag, but it's yellow.
If only they were waiting for us somewhere, the nights we didn't use, the things we didn't do, the bridge we didn't lean on in the moonlight, watching the barges pass beneath our feet. Instead, a faint glimmer appears on the horizon, as if someone was signalling through mist. A ghost with a yellow shopping bag waves to a yellow raincoat at the other end of a street.
Hugo, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. It's been
Well, actually, you were rather
treat.
good yourself, I thought. I think you're bloody good at this job.
Thank you so much. You can come again.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLFCollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.